Thank you very much, Rachel and Ian, for inviting me to speak to everyone about decolonising the forensic curricula. So my colleagues and I recently published a paper in Science and Justice relating to our reflection on how we go about decolonising the curriculum. Now, it's worth saying that we are in very early stages, and decolonising the curriculum isn't about doing it in one go overnight. It simply doesn't work in that way. So I'm speaking from the University of Winchester, where there is a very strong commitment from the institution to decolonise the curriculum. And something that you need to understand about the university is that it's very much based in the humanities and social sciences. And so we had, in the forensics team, we had a little bit of a debate about, well, how, to what extent can we decolonise the curriculum in STEM? How is it even possible, and if it is even desirable at that stage? And so we've had these discussions, and we felt for us, yes, this is something that we should be pursuing. So first off, for those who hadn't been to a previous session where you discussed decolonising the curriculum, we sometimes refer to that as DTC. So if I say that, that's what I mean. We need to appreciate that there are lots of different models of DTC. Some of them are absolutist, extreme. There have been some debates about throwing out all of science and starting again. Well, that's not possible for us, because for programs like ours, we want to be doing this again and again, year in and year out. We cannot simply throw away all of science, and that to us would not be desirable. Now, the definition that we are working with is decolonising the curriculum is seeking to question and dismantle colonial structures of knowledge, and we're then going to be supporting contextualization through broadening rather than narrowing the curricula. So for us, we see this as a positive thing. We see this as an opportunity to contextualize and actually develop the quality of education. Now, I'm sitting here with my quality hat on in the University of Winchester. I also have a quality role for my faculty. And part of our inquiry was really, how do we bridge the gap between quality assurance and also scientific rigour? The thing that we need to get across is we are not throwing out science. That is a very absolute and extremist perspective on DTC that my team don't, we just simply haven't taken on that particular that position. Now, for us, we thought about, well, how do we actually make a start? So I'm going to be talking about really our first steps. I'm then going to be thinking about some of the reflective questions that we've answered along the way. And then I'm going to be showing you 2 areas of the curriculum that we have been able to really interrogate further. I don't want to be sitting here preaching to anyone about how they decolonise their curriculum. This is very much based on individual programme teams, and programme teams evolve over time. And what might be possible for one team may not be possible for another. But for us, our starting point was simply recognising where bias exists. So that might be where we have a tendency perhaps to parade particular techniques and inventors or developers of those techniques, and we select those over other techniques, or where we tend to highlight where there has been success, but maybe we haven't highlighted the criticism as well. Now, for us, once we recognise areas where there could be bias, then we have to put in place a strategy for incremental and phased approaches to DTC. So again, this is not an overnight thing. This is not a big bang approach. This is something where it's, for it to be sustainable, it has to be rigorous and it has to be very well thought out. And it's not about eroding quality. Now, we were very lucky because we are able to be integrated within a formal quality process. So that is our quality. We've got a whole department dedicated to quality, and they help us through things like revalidation. So for those who aren't aware, programs go through a life cycle where they then have to go through scrutiny for currency, and we have to essentially make sure that our curricula is fit for purpose for the employers who will be employing our graduates. So we call that revalidation, but also you have other formalised processes such as accreditation through charter societies, for instance. But then we also need to think about leadership, not just within our institution and from our professional societies, but we also need to be thinking about the role of external examiners, professional bodies, but also students, where there is also an appetite for decolonisation. So we started off very simply with self-reflective questions. So, for instance, focusing in on how do we present history of our subject, of our discipline? How do we frame certain concepts as they're understood within the curriculum? Do we highlight where we have perhaps got connections with a colonial past and, you know, some really horrific pasts as well? Do we highlight that? And what would be the consequence of doing so? We also think about where opportunities exist within the curriculum to explore and examine representations of race. So are we always demonstrating maybe one very fixed view of power dynamics? So for instance, are we showing images of court, maybe a white judge, white male judges? Are we always showing positions of authority being occupied by white individuals? There are little things that we can start to be aware of in our own practice. And as we become aware of them, that is our first step to then making changes later on so that we then represent our student community. Another question, in what ways does the curriculum promote inclusivity and accommodate those from various backgrounds? And in what ways does the curriculum reproduce colonial attitudes? Now, I'm going to be focusing on two of these. So the first one is how do forensic histories, how are they currently presented within the curriculum? And then also how do we reproduce colonial attitudes and what can we really do about it? So if we go into this first one, about our histories. Now, because we've got this rendezvous discipline, forensics doesn't just have one history, it doesn't share a history, but we have lots and lots of individuals who have made a contribution, and they may be coming from various disciplinary backgrounds. Now, what we have had in the past, perhaps, and perhaps we may still have this going on in some lecture theatres, is where we've got a parade of white men's successes, and we tend to demonstrate history as a linear progression. Now, from my background, I've been trained in history in my undergraduate degree, and so we were always taught, you know, you've got to contextualize this. You've got to not just cherry pick, you've got to be very systematic in doing so. Now, one individual who's been excellent at this is Dr. Adam Rutherford at UCL, who really highlighted the issues with Francis Galton and the Galton Institute there, where we celebrate Galton, perhaps maybe in forensics for his contributions to fingerprinting and statistics. Others, you know, maybe thinking more of him as an explorer, but also what some students may not be aware of is he was the founder of eugenics, and he was very interested in the way in which family resemblances were inherited. Now, when we are presenting our histories, we then really need to be thinking about taking an unbiased, critical, this objective approach. So one of the things that I would do is I would be encouraging taking that critical approach to authoritative texts, not just a timeline of events, but actually fleshing it out a little more so that we have, if we've got a key figure, well, let's actually understand that key figure as a whole human being and in the context of the intellectual progression of the day. So these individuals cannot be seen in isolation. They are frequently part of an intellectual movement which reflects social anxieties. If we can then offer a balanced and objective presentation of historical figures, then we can also present the evidence of what they were saying. And if we contextualize that, then our students can understand that, okay, yes, they have contributed in this way. However, when we look at some of the quoted material that celebrate their achievements, well, if we go on one page longer, and I'm thinking particularly Hans Gross, where we've got, you know, a section of his material which is widely quoted in forensics, but then you go on one page and then you are deep within misogyny, deep within xenophobia and racism, and that isn't presented to students. So we felt it was important to contextualize wherever we have quotes, go to the quoted material, get students actually dealing with the historical material. This allows them to then criticize those figures in context, and then that also allows us to present contemporary criticisms of their work. I think it's about being transparent, therefore, in some of the selections that we have chosen as educators, because there is a particular narrative, there is a particular learning objective that we want our students to understand and appreciate. And when we do have that, we can actually provide really great learning, tangible learning opportunities for our students. Now, when we then think about where these opportunities lie within curricula, not every forensic science programme or forensic investigation programme is going to have a dedicated module to a history of forensic science like we have. So we have to think about, well, where are the colonial attitudes perhaps coming along? Where are those opportunities to interrogate our histories? It's just simply critical history. That's all it is. Where we then start thinking about where forensic science intersects with power. Once you understand those power dynamics, you open up beyond race and you start also thinking in terms of the intersection with gender, sexuality and social stratification. Then we're really contextualizing intellectual movements where, yes, we have benefited from certain developments, but also at a cost, where there has been oppression, which is rife in our history of criminal justice. So we can also then think about, well, it's not just a linear progression. We can also start thinking about some of the sciences that fell out of use. So when we present some of the sciences, in inverted commas, that have fallen out of use. I mean, for instance, if you think about physiognomics in the 1930s, 1940s, and that was from the 19th century onwards, and also demonology from around, well, certainly in the 17th century, we have got excerpts of demonology expert witnesses being called on in court. We just don't recognise it as a science, but it was back then. Now, there are very obvious barriers to undertaking DTC work, and it's not, as I said before, it's not about preaching at people to change their practice. I'm just merely showing opportunities where, if you feel so inclined, this is where you could perhaps start. First off, in the sciences, we do need to value historical work, and I think there's been really great progress in this area. We also need to recognise that intro lectures, where there might be more historical focus, tend to be presented by newer members of staff, or they have been inherited by members of staff, so they haven't actually written that content, and so they may not even have time to go back, understand the sources, and they may be focusing more on the learning outcomes. Okay, now that is a curriculum decision that needs to be made, perhaps at a higher level, I would suggest. One way that you can tackle it is perhaps by taking a non-linear approach, so more of a thematic approach. And there are going to be lots of opportunities within the curriculum where you can undertake that. But to get support from the institution is perhaps the first step I would suggest, because it isn't about just having one individual who goes into this, who does a more socially toned module. It's about getting the team's involvement, but also support from the institution. And that means getting a whole toolkit in terms of resources. So for historical sources, you can get real trial transcripts. These are freely available online, the Old Bailey online. Diaries, historical data. There are lots of websites that can also help you, like the Panopticon. So if we then go back to here, and I'm now going to focus on in what ways does the curriculum reproduce colonial attitudes. Now, speaking from the perspective of forensic archaeology, we have been working in a very colonial subject. If we think about archaeology, we can think about perhaps this type of image from The Mummy, the film The Mummy, 1932, where you'll have explorers, archaeologists wearing their pith helmets on the sidelines and getting the locals to go into dangerous areas. Now, if we're not careful when we are dealing with topics such as mass graves, there has been sometimes the tendency to show images which might smack of this type of thing. So we've got to be really careful in the way that we actually frame in where we have cases where we've got international casework, where teams have been sent from perhaps countries within the global north to countries in the global south or the global east. Now, this, if we're not careful, simply reproduces colonial attitudes, and certainly that may not be the intention behind it, but that can be the takeaway point that students might come away with. Now, in terms of our approaches, it was very widely understood within forensic archaeology, and we were warned about this definitely in the 90s with Margaret Cox, that we've got to avoid this sort of what she termed parachuting in concept, which we might today call a white saviour attitude, where we then go, we are deployed in inverted commas, and we then go and help less fortunate communities. There is an assumption that they are not capable of handling an investigation of great complexity. We were warned against this in the mid-90s because that doesn't simply ring true. And we have seen amazing organizations like the EAAF, based in Argentina, really demonstrate that local communities should have agency and should take on decision-making roles in things like war crimes, the disappeared, mass graves, those kinds of situations. Another aspect is perhaps finding a balance between success and failure. Now, when we are teaching, we sometimes have to take the shortcut to show you the final results, don't we? We've got to show, if I'm teaching about a mass grave, well, you really want to be then seeing a mass grave and you want to see the contents of it and you understand the formation processes of it. But what may not be shown is the ratio between success and failure and the number of searches that have been failed. If we then go to more localized material, perhaps material not in English, we will then find a wealth of information about those experiences people have had, investigators have had, in terms of trying to find some of these sites and failing, and trying to understand some of the barriers, the unique barriers that they face, that perhaps us in the UK don't quite understand. So this also goes down to a publishing route. What is being published? What do we have access to? Which is also a barrier that we need to overcome. So we can focus on locally led cases. We should definitely be inquiring about how local labour forces have been recruited in some of these case studies. And we also need to contextualise perceived differences. So by that, I mean, if we start seeing photographs where perhaps forensic workers aren't adhering to our expectations of, say, anti-contamination strategies, well, there might be a very good reason why. So we need to try and take the effort to understand it rather than simply criticising, well, this is at a lower level of expectation than we have in the UK. We need to interrogate that. Why might that be the case? We also need to start considering about our concepts. So within the UK, forensic science is very much focused on the evidential model because that's linked to justice, i.e. we are providing evidence for or against something happening, essentially, inculpatory evidence and exculpatory evidence. Now, in other communities, other cultures, they may not have the same concept of justice that we hold. And so the evidential model isn't as important. It simply isn't a priority. And what you might have, which is a greater priority, is perhaps a humanitarian one, or even a more spiritual one, where justice is served in a spiritual world. So we've got to be very careful not to impose our Western concepts onto others. And that might include justice, our concepts of what is decent and right, and especially attitudes to the dead. So, for instance, we have this idea that in our society, in the UK, that repatriation of the dead to their community is a good thing. Now, not all communities feel that way. Not all cultures feel that way. And I mean, this is something that I can talk for hours and hours about, and I won't. But I think the point being raised is that we've got to be very careful not to make assumptions on other cultures. Now, if you don't have a forensic archaeology or anthropology module where this can then be brought in, well, anywhere where you talk about genocide, war crimes, humanitarian aid, or any international casework, this is where you can have those fruitful discussions. And I think once you start having those discussions about power dynamics and how power is portrayed within lectures, within case material, within resources, including reading lists, it then goes further. It's not simply about internationalization. We can also start thinking about within the UK and our societies, plural, and how those power dynamics are played out. Now, of course, we have barriers. Why is it that we aren't all doing this? Well, for one, in order to do this sensibly and responsibly, you actually need a lot of time for deep discussion, and you need to have that understanding that not everyone is going to get it right the first time. And there's got to be space for growth and learning. We do need access to journals in other languages so that we can access locally led complex forensic investigations that simply are invisible to us because they're not in English. And I also think we need CPT opportunities through our charter societies, through the institution, and in terms of the university institution, so that we can start to workshop some of these ideas and have that space for robust debate. Now, in terms of pathways to achieve some of this, I think it's just about taking baby steps if this is new to you. So start the conversation, find out what the team actually think. Do you think about contacting your inclusivity team to ask what is actually going on in your institution? Who is doing this work? Because some people are quite shy about it because it is controversial and it can attract quite a strong response. Do also think about contacting professional societies about what work they are undertaking in DTC. And if you are doing some work in this area, please do contribute to DTC toolkits. So reading lists, lecture content, guidance notes, and case studies that you may have found. All right, so that's my time. So I will pass back, I think, at this stage, if I can do that.
Thank you, Anna. I was really looking forward to this talk, and I'm not disappointed at all. Really excellent work that yourself, your colleagues in the University of Winchester are undertaking in decolonising the curriculum, and particularly nice to see not only the concept and the reflective questions, but some examples of how you've applied it within your own curricula. So now it's over to questions. Though I could ask my own for a long period of time, I'm going to go straight to the ones in the chat. So Rachel has asked a question, and I'll just read it out for the recording. It says, how can we gain access to broader contexts and histories and know which are reliable before we start to discuss and share these with our students?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So we have some really fantastic resources out there. The Old Bailey Online is really good because you then have trial transcripts. It's a very intuitive search function as well. And it might be that we need to sort of undertake some kind of CPD workshop to really get to grips with how to then find some of these sources. They are out there. They are digitized frequently. Some of them are also typed up so that you have accessible versions. So that's one. I'd always triangulate. So if you've got a trial transcript, if you can then find it, especially with London Lives, you can usually find some complementary material, but you also will have contemporary sources such as newspaper articles as well. So they might all corroborate a sense of what might be going on within a trial. And it's really great for students, especially in the first year, to then start interrogating real trial transcripts to figure out what was evidence back then, how did evidence maneuver within the criminal justice system.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting that the examples you give around the integration of culture as part of, the forensic kind of narrative, particularly when the examples you gave about, burial rights and around the white saviour complex. I think that's particularly interesting. So my question is, I guess a lot of people who teach areas like forensic science see it as an academic subject and try and ignore the political and economical and social kind of environments within which their subjects sit because of uncomfortableness. So how do you overcome, you personally or your colleagues overcome that initial step of bringing society into your disciplinary subject?
Yeah, I think it's a really valid point, because essentially there is a way to just simply remove it. So one model might be simply, well, the history, I'm just not going to do the timeline. I'm not going to do the parade of all these individuals, the successful individuals. By removing it, are you really contextualizing and understanding the place of the development of that particular science? Are you contextualizing it within its intellectual context? And once you understand perhaps that intellectual context, that social context as well, I think it's far more tangible for students to relate to. Now, I had come from the humanities anyway, so of course you can put political opinion to one side, absolutely, but you can't be blind to where there is bias within our own practice. And I think when we are selecting material, we have to recognise we are selecting that material, or someone has, another practitioner, another educator has selected that material. And there's got to be a pedagogical reason, a curriculum-based reason why that material has been selected and what value it actually holds. And what are our students then going away with? I don't want any of my students to then sort of think that women weren't involved in forensic science because they couldn't be bothered in history. I don't want them to think that people based in the UK were always the leaders of all forensic sciences at all times. That would just be incorrect. So I've never had a problem with it, but mainly because I'm an archaeologist, where we recognise that you can't really divorce science and knowledge from the society in which it serves.
Thank you, Anna. That was excellent. I'm conscious of time, so though I'd like to ask more questions, I'll refrain. But a few people are asking you things in the chat, and certainly you've already made an impact in someone's teaching resources, which is great to see.